Welcome everyone to the fourth panel discussion on mapping global populism. It's a series organized by European Center for Populism Studies along with its partners. This is Dr. Fiza Batul. I am a member of ECPS Early Career Research Network, and on behalf of ECPS, I thank all the attendees, all the participants of today's panel. For the new guests who are not aware of ECPS, ECPS is actually an independent organization, non-profit organization, which is based in Brussels, and it conducts research and analysis on challenges posed by the increasing political populism around the world. And we actually started with a series on mapping European populism, and after concluding it, we decided that we need to discuss populism beyond the borders of Europe. And then we expanded the panel series to global populism. And the objective was, and obviously it still is, to have a complete picture of populism around the globe with monthly sessions throughout the year. This year in March, we had our first session on the global populism. It was in far right in Australia. Then in April, we had a session on illiberalism in the Philippines. The third panel was on religious populism and radicalization in Indonesia. All the reports, the recorded videos of each panel discussion, they are published on our website. They are available on our YouTube channel. And I highly, highly recommend them for anyone, for all the students, scholars, policymakers, anyone who is concerned about the current challenges to democracy by this rise of political populism around the world. So please do check our website, do visit our YouTube channel, and watch these programs and read the reports. Today is our fourth session, which specifically on the rise of populism, radicalization, and Hindutva in India. We are grateful to our co-organizer, the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation, and the Adelaide University. We are also grateful to all the scholars, experts who are sharing their years of work and wisdom in our panel discussion today. That being said, let me introduce the moderators and panelists. Our moderator, Dr. Priya Chacko, is a senior lecturer in international politics at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Adelaide. Her current research project focuses on the impact of market reform on India's foreign policy and social policy and the intersection of Hindu nationalism, populism, and neoliberalism in Indian politics and policy making. She teaches courses and supervises research on foreign policy and South Asian politics. Previously, she held position at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. The first speaker in the panel is Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy. He will talk about politics, ethics, and emotions in New India. Dr. Gudavarthy is an associate professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He teaches courses on Indian politics, political theory, and democratization. Before his position at Jawaharlal Nehru University, he taught as an assistant professor at National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and a lecturer at National University of Judicial Sciences, Calcutta. Soon to be Dr. Maggie Paul. She will be another speaker in the panel, and the title of her speech is Ram Rajya 2.0, How Nostalgia Aids the Populist Politics of Neo-Colonial Hindutva Futurism. Maggie Paul is a PhD candidate in Politics and International Relations at the University of Adelaide. Her PhD thesis is tentatively titled Insecuritization of the Citizenship Regime, Bangladeshi Infiltrators, and the Politics of Insecurity in India. A very interesting topic. So her broader interests include the contestation of citizenship in South Asian contexts, politics at the urban margin, as well as decolonial past development and blue reversal theory and practices. And she also teaches global politics. She had taught at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, Mumbai, and had research consultation position with various non-profit in India. She is also a member of activist circles such as the National Alliance of People's Movement in India, global cohort of the Dalai Lama Fellows. She had presented at several international conferences, the most recent one titled Citizenship Until Further Notice, supported by Science Foundation and Emotions of Inclusion and Exclusion in Transnational Spaces. Third speaker is Dr. Anuj Bhuwania, who was speaking on the law and populism with a lecture titled Constitutional Roots of Judicial Populism in India. Dr. Bhuwania did his BA LLB at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and an LLM from School of Oriental African Studies. Before completing his PhD at Columbia University, New York. So he had previously taught at South Asian University and Ambedkar University, Delhi, and held several various positions, including at the Center of Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen, Center for the Study of Law and Governance at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the Center for the Study of Developing Studies in New Delhi. He is also the author of the book Courting the People, Public Interest in Litigation in Post-Emergency India, which was published by Cambridge University in 2017. This takes us to the fourth and fifth speaker, who are jointly presenting a topic. The first one is Dr. Monica Bhartwal Datta. She is a senior lecturer in international security in the School of Social Sciences, Sydney, UNSW Sydney. Monica research areas include critical security studies, securitization studies, strategic narratives, foreign policy. Empirically, her research focus includes non-traditional security issues, particularly food security, non-state actors, and regional security challenges in South Asia, and Indian foreign policy. So Monica was awarded her PhD by Royal Holloway College, University of London, and holds an MSc in security studies from Amsterdam University. She also has a master's in international journalism from Cardiff University and has worked as a broadcast journalist for the BBC World Service Radio in London for several years. Monica is the author of Food Security in Asia, Challenges, Policies, and Implication, and Understanding Security Practices in South Asia, Securitization Theory, and Role of Non-State Actors. Shweta Singh, who's co-presenting with Monica, is Associate Professor of International Relations at South Asia University. Her research broadly focuses on feminist international relations, women, peace and security agenda, critical peace and conflict studies, gender and populism, and feminist peace research. Her most recent publications include a special issue on rethinking violence, everyday and insecurity, feminist intersectional intervention in the Journal of Human Security, and gendering education for peace, critical perspective in Tarja Bayerian, if I'm pronouncing it right, in the Handbook of Feminist Peace Research, and towards an intersectional approach to populism, comparative perspective from Finland and India in contemporary politics. So with this, I am
Did Fiza drop out?
Yep.
Okay.
You can continue.
I will continue. Okay. Thank you, Fiza, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on populism in India. Thank you to all the speakers for agreeing to speak to us today. And thank you for the audience members for joining us as well. So in the last decade, India has been transformed by an authoritarian populist politics, which uses populist strategies to legitimize exclusionary and authoritarian policies. To name just a few, NGOs and research centres with foreign funding have had their licenses cancelled. Students, scholars, journalists, activists have been charged with sedition and languish in jails. The few remaining independent media outlets are threatened with tax investigations and defamation lawsuits. Laws have been introduced to curb interreligious marriage, religious conversion, and the consumption of beef. Constitutional autonomy for Jammu and Kashmir has been revoked. The government practices a variety of forms of digital authoritarianism. Citizenship laws codify the use of religion as criteria for Indian citizenship. Social and economic policies privilege the private sector and big business. Muslims have been targeted with punitive punishments. Parliament has been reduced to a rubber stamp, and opposition politicians have been targeted with defamation lawsuits. These actions and policies have been legitimised through populist discourses. NGOs, students, activists, the media, opposition parties, and previous governments are all portrayed as self-interested elites, influenced by foreign ideologies who pander to minorities. Both these elites and minorities are portrayed as threatening Hindus and undermining India's development. And the Indian people who are being defended and empowered by the government, so they say, are constructed as Hindu. These are just a few of the developments that have taken place in India over the last decade. The speakers in this panel are going to discuss a few more, and they're going to shed some light on how we got here and what the future might hold. Authoritarian populism in India has been resisted, and there have been protests and political mobilizations against the government and its policies. But the regime at the national level has been resilient, and it's expected to win at the next election. In part, I think this is because what's happening in India isn't just the result of the current government, it's a culmination and acceleration of decades of social, political, and economic change, all of which were already moving India in exclusionary and authoritarian directions. The speakers today are going to explore some of these issues. Anuj is discussing the role of courts in facilitating populist politics. Ajay and Maggie are discussing the role of emotions and nostalgia in building consent for populist politics. And Monica and Shweta are discussing how populist politics shapes foreign policies. These are understudied issues in the literature on populism in general and on Indian authoritarian populism in particular. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Ajay Gudavarthy. Indian authoritarian populism is an intensely affective form of politics, which depends on the incitement of emotions. And Ajay's new book is the first to explore this in detail. Ajay, thank you for sharing your insights today.
So, thanks, Priya. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so let me begin by thanking Priya for this opportunity. So I'm going to broadly draw from my new book, Politics, Ethics and Emotions in New India. And broadly, go back to the classical formulation of Lucknow on populism, which broadly argues in terms of drawing an equivalence between fragmented social demands in order to draw the notion of the authentic people. So he talks about equivalence and antagonism, as we all know. That has been somewhat a classical formulation on populism, and which is what Lucknow refers to as something that is fully political. But coming to the Indian case study, I mean, I'm testing this formulation of Lucknow's in the Indian case, where you do have Hindutva politics emerging in terms of that new civil solidarity, in terms of the new normative universal, where it did manage to kind of draw an equivalence of demands across castes. Now it is even pitching across religion by making an appeal to Pasmanda Muslims, across linguistic groups. Given the humongous cultural diversity in India, I don't think it's no mean achievement that Hindutva could even generate this bit of consolidated, authentic majoritarian social group and social consciousness. So my question really is that ideologically Hindutva politics continue to remain authoritarian. They do have a conservative in terms of reinforcing existing social hierarchies and social power. They do continue to work in the registers of power and interest, yet they seem to be able to successfully appropriate the normative universal in the cultural registers. And part of my hypothesis in the book is that it is possible that it is able to do that through an appeal to everyday ethics and latent emotions. But the larger question still remains that how does Hindutva populism manage to do both the things simultaneously? That what we seem to be witnessing in India over the last 10 years is that on one hand, Hindutva has emerged as the new hegemonic articulation of civil solidarity and a new normative universal that has managed to draw equivalence cutting across castes. But on the other hand, we are also seeing a simultaneous sharpening of social conflicts between at the level of subcaste within Dalits, at the level of subcaste within OBCs. We are seeing new type of old linguistic conflicts emerging, for instance, between Maharashtra and Karnataka, re-emerging. We recently witnessed conflicts in Manipur, Haryana. So there is fair bit of social fragmentation that is being reinscribed. So moving, this seems to be some kind of an anomaly from the Lucknow's kind of formulation that the equivalence does not really generate a kind of a unified, authentic population. But this authentic generation of population is actually based on deepening of social fragmentation. And this, I think, is a very, very interesting question to see that how these two processes are happening simultaneously. Social political scientists like Susan and Lloyd Rudolphs, writing way back in 80s, argued that India is a centrist polity, that there is a very little possibility of confessional majority emerging in the Indian context because of the latent caste differences, and they kind of fragment, and therefore there is no possibility of emergence. But what is happening today in the Indian context is precisely flowing in the opposite direction. So this is where I have about 2 or 3 broad formulations and hypotheses in terms of how is this being made possible by Hindutva populism. One point that I argue in the book and later I've been developing is that the reinterpretation of caste and religion, not in terms of modern cultural identities as we often understand in terms of bounded identities, as we perhaps understand in the discourse on multiculturalism. But what we are witnessing in the Indian narrative in context is a certain kind of a culturalization of caste and religion. That is, that there is a reinterpretation of religion and caste more in terms of a way of life rather than in terms of bounded identities. An interesting article recently that Akhil Bilgrami's on Gandhi, the vexed question of caste. Akhil Bilgrami, in fact, makes this very interesting point that the Gandhian defense of Varna system was in terms of, he makes a very interesting argument that it was in terms of defending Varnas and caste differences as a way of life, and gives a more heterogeneous interpretation rather than a hierarchical interpretation. And Gandhi was attempting to fight hierarchies and discrimination within caste system outside the liberal apparatus and outside modern market and monetization. That Gandhi's attempt was in terms of preserving the sense of collective living, way of living and cultural life world that belonged to caste groups, and fight hierarchies from within tradition and culture rather than external through liberal state and monetization on modern economy. What is interesting is that Hindutva comes very close to contemporary understanding on a social arrangement of Hindutva in terms of the way they are drawing an equivalence between religion as community, community as culture, and culture as civilization. If you look at the multiple narratives and discourses that that Hindutva politics is simultaneously operating in the Indian context, you would observe this kind of lateralization or this kind of heterogeneity, that their defense in essence is that of heterogeneity of caste and religion, that they don't explicitly talk in terms of purity and pollution or in terms of reinscribing hierarchies. But there is enough possibility within this narrative to kind of reinscribe traditional hierarchies and traditional segregation. So a big question really for those of us who are watching the events closely in terms of Hindutva populism is that there is no place for an explicit upfront critique today of Hindutva politics in terms of the old caste order in terms of the old narratives of Manusmriti, purity, pollution, and things of that kind. Today it is speaking in different registers. Even I have written a recent piece of the return of the Brahmin, that Brahmins today do not vouch by Manusmriti, but they are talking more in terms of preservation of a certain cultural life world. I think this kind of a new narrative that has come, which this can go back in time to the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar. We, of course, don't have time to get into that. But I think Hindutva, by and large, that Hindutva is re-signifying caste and religion outside modernity in terms of modern identities and re-inscribing as culture as a way of life. That which partly explains why the Hindutva project has a certain purchase, which is a bottom-up purchase, why Dalits and OBCs are able to also identify with Hindutva project, and they do not, like left liberal secular scholars, see it as an authoritarian top-down project. But there is a certain kind of owning up of Dalits and OBCs, because this culturalization of caste and religion allows for certain space for Dalits and Bahujans to also kind of identify with the Hindutva project. But within this, one can also sense the way hierarchies can be. I don't have the time to get into the details, but how Hindutva will move on to kind of re-inscribe traditional social hierarchies. So how do we disengage the two? How do we create a new kind of a wedge to open up for a certain counter narrative? I think is still an open and a very complex question that we need to frame. Second quick narrative, the strategy that Hindutva is adopting is in terms of what I would refer to a sociology, Robert Bella's writings in some type of nationalism as a civic religion. Bella talks about how nationalism is a kind of a civic religion for contemporary times, where you have a symbolism, ritual, faith, national anthem, national flag invoked as part of a civilizational discourse. So nationalism, he says, in fact, is like a civic religion in contemporary times. If you also observe Hindutva narrative on civilization and nationalism, it offers a very porous kind of space for that kind of a civic ethos, which is inclusive, which talks about Indic civilization. In fact, it says that even Muslims born in Indic civilization are essentially Hindus, that Hindu is more a cultural identity, Hindu is more about a way of life, rather than a kind of an exclusionary identity in terms of ritualistic practice or organized religion. But what is very interesting is that, if you go back to somebody like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, he argued that a civilizational narrative is emerging, which would kind of trump nation state. But if you observe the Hindutva mode of mobilization, the new kind of civilizational discourse is actually reinscribing a new kind of hyper-nationalism. So this kind of new equivalence between civilization and nationalism, I think also throws up very many interesting questions for us in terms of how it's working on the ground. And therefore, in populist literature, Priya, you would know, we have often this supply and demand side of populism. So the demand side of the populism, the way people are receiving populism on the ground and Hindutva strategies is more in terms of a sense of belonging. And therefore, I've argued for long that this overt discourses of polarization, Islamophobia, authoritarian state, illiberality, undermining of institutions, none of this seem to have appeal in terms of popular mobilization and popular politics, because the essential identification towards a project of Hindutva on the ground is through a deeper sense of what Ashish Nandi would call cultural selves. That Hindutva is giving new space for cultural selves and for a deep sense of cultural belonging. It is a different matter that it is then converting this sense of belonging to toxic majoritarianism, polarized system, undermining institutions, and reinscribing authoritarianism. And all of this, the important and the most challenging part for us, those of analyzing in terms of producing a counter narrative, not merely as an academic exercise, but also with certain kind of a political investment, would be that all of this has a certain fair purchase on the ground, and it cuts across castes and regions, and now also religion to an extent with the pitching Pasmanda Muslim. I would draw your attention to conclude, I would draw your attention to the Pew Research survey that the New York Pew Research conducted on religion in India in terms of tolerance. And it's a very, very fascinating survey, and one of the largest surveys that has happened in post-independence period, where they ask a cross-section of caste, religions, and regions in terms of what do Indians think about diversity and tolerance. An overwhelming 70% of Indians who participate in a survey said that diversity and tolerance are an absolutely important for democracy. So Indians do understand and do value tolerance, do value secularism, do value diversity. And what is startling in this survey is that 64% of those who have voted for the BJP have argued that no, tolerance and diversity are essential for democracy. But when it came to a question of concrete living, all castes and cutting across religions said that they all believe in segregated living. So the survey typifies this as living together separately. That Indians value in abstract notions of diversity and tolerance, but when it comes to concrete social arrangement, they would prefer segregated living, that they would want to cohabit with their own caste groups and within their own religious denominations. I think this should again draw our attention to, unlike Ambedkar's agenda of graded inequalities, which he interpreted in a different sense. I think what we find today on the ground is this combination of open-ended political investment, political democracy, but when it comes to social arrangement, caste and religion have increasingly converted them into some kind of cultural conglomerations. I think a critique of populist Hindutva mobilization, whether on the kind of authoritarian, whether in terms of illiberal institutional undermining that we are witnessing, has to speak to this, the reasons why Hindutva populism has a certain popular purchase on the ground. And therefore, I think our narrative cannot afford to kind of collapse the distinction between the way Hindutva is received in terms of a deeper sense of belief, deeper sense of belonging and building cultural selves, as against authoritarian and toxic majoritarian. Maintaining that analytical distinction between the two, I think provides us an entry point in terms of offering a meaningful critique of Hindutva populism. I think I'll stop here. I've finished my 15 minutes, and I thank Priya again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ajay. Now, next we have Maggie Paul. Now, Maggie, I'm sharing your presentation. Maggie is presenting a paper that we are co-authoring. Maggie is my PhD student, and it's very much a work in progress. We're still working through the concepts and the analysis, so we welcome any suggestions. Maggie, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know when to change the slide.
Yeah, I'll let you know. So, hello everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I mean, in many ways, like Priya said, this is a work in progress, and this is kind of an expansion of a paper that we both wrote, like primarily Priya and I'm just co-authoring. In the Red Pepper magazine, we wrote a paper titled Ram Rajya 2.0. We've significantly expanded on it, but it's very much a work in progress. In many ways, it's good that I'm following Dr. Gudavarthy, because I think there's a bit of like continuation, and of course, like we are also kind of in some ways talking to what he was speaking about cultural belonging and cultural selves and culturalization in many ways. But we are focusing on the role of this, the nostalgia, the aspect of nostalgia. So if we can move to the next slide, Priya. Basically, I'd like to start with a quote. So there are many quotes in this, just to contextualize what I'm saying. This is mostly from the populist leader-in-chief, Narendra Modi, in various occasions on various platforms. So I thought I'll just start with this one. This was at the inauguration of the new parliament. And he's talking about, like I've highlighted the key points that he keeps repeating in many of the platforms. So this is, he's talking about that there was a time when India was among the most prosperous and splendid nations of the world. And it used to amaze travelers from across the world about its ingenuity and prosperity. But hundreds of years of slavery has took this pride away from us. And there was also a time when, Indians were looking at other countries, other nations, and getting fascinated by what is happening there. But the India of today, like new India of 21st century, is full of high spirits, and it's leaving behind this mindset of slavery. And how it is doing that is by turning the glorious stream of ancient times towards itself. And it is full of pride, and it's doing this, and it's prepared to work for the 21st century, which of course belongs to India in the world. The whole world knows that. And it's doing that through performing duties for India. So this is a very like kind of typical quote, which encompasses many of the things that we're talking about. So next slide, if you can move to the next slide, please. So nostalgia is a key link between constructions of the past in populist mobilization and societal responsiveness to populist politics. And nostalgia, that is the form of valorization and recovery of symbols of golden ages, both historical and mythological, have been central to populist politics. But the literature on this is mostly limited to the geographical scope. It's mostly limited in its geographical scope, and with a predominant focus on Europe and Turkey. So our aim, next slide, if you can move to the next slide. So our aim is basically to talk about the continuing, frequent, and growing force of nostalgia in Indian politics, which is used in conjunction with populist mobilization for electoral purposes. And in doing so, our aim is to draw out the links between nostalgia, affect, and populism. In a way, better theorizing the affective politics of authoritarian populism in India, and contributing to the growing literature on nostalgia and populism across the world. So just briefly, if we can move to the next slide, please. Just briefly, if we talk about some of the existing literature on populism and nostalgia, it focuses on right-wing populism and identifies the source of nostalgia as golden ages associated with recent past, such as the welfare state, such as a time when the welfare state flourished, a time when political correctness was not prevalent, or when the society was more culturally homogeneous, or in some cases with imperial past like the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, etc. And this literature draws on nostalgia scholarship, which identifies different kinds of nostalgia. One being restorative nostalgia that seeks to create a glorious past in the present. Reflective nostalgia, which is more detached and it's ambivalent and critical of the present, and a more pastoral nostalgia, which promotes familiarity and comfort of tradition and simplicity in the present. While both forms of nostalgia may be present in populist politics, restorative nostalgia has been highlighted to be dominant in right-wing populist mobilization. Much of the literature utilizes an ideational approach to understanding populism, using theories from social psychology to study nostalgia and its relation to populism as a form of psychocultural memory politics. But works in Turkey, and emotions are present, but they are often under-theorized in many of these literature that we have kind of reviewed. And work in Turkey, some works on Turkey particularly point to invocation of religious sentiment in the political uses of nostalgia. Next slide, please. So our framework, first of all, kind of has a argues that there is a problem with this ideational approach. The predominant ideational approach to analyzing populism, with its emphasis on discursive construction of a pure people against corrupt elite, is, as several critics have argued, analytically restrictive. Modi's regime's populist strategies involves the discursive articulation of disparate group into unified but not homogeneous category of people through an affective economy of emotions relating to both resentment and aspiration, which generates its own dynamics in society. Moreover, while studies of populism and nostalgia emphasize the role of emotion and affect, the ideational approach does not give us any tools to analyze this relationship. So we use Laclau approach to populism, which is populism as a logic of political articulation, which acknowledges the significance of affect in populist politics and thus offers a more fruitful, though underdeveloped path for understanding the importance of nostalgia. Some of it is what Dr. Gudavarthy kind of talked about, like Laclau argues that populist mobilization depends on the construction of an equivalential chain where different kinds of social claims are bound together to create a kind of antagonistic frontier against the powerful and the institutions that can no longer absorb them, like the elites. A vague feeling of solidarity is therefore condensed out of diverse forms of social grievances to create a popular subjectivity and collective will, which is underpinned by an equivalential bond between different popular demands. So this is what we are basing, this is what our framework bases itself on. And there is the role of affect or emotion is very crucial in creating a sustained effort that is needed to bring different groups together to create solidarity and mobilize divisions and collectivities in society. But Laclau kind of focuses on, like he emphasizes on grievances and antagonism in generating collective identification processes, but that produces like a weak account of how collective identity is formed. So like Tidgens, she argues that constructing popular identities requires strong collective emotions and passions of empathy and sympathy. So we feel that in addition to negative emotions like fear, frustration, and hate, positive ones like love and enthusiasm for a common political project centered on unmet demands are needed for populist politics to succeed. In this, we are also drawing from Sara Ahmed, because she talks about as emotions as cultural practices that produce the psychic and social. And it's important to understand how emotions and passions work to form, to mobilize and articulate divisions and collectivities in society that Laclau is talking about. She argues that emotions don't reside in individuals and they circulate in societies, creating the surfaces of individuals and collective bodies and boundaries between them. So for instance, so they gain prevalence through circulation. So pain, for instance, is constantly invoked in public discourses, including in populist discourses, to align subjects with each other and to spur action against the objects and bodies deemed to be the cause of pain. Similarly, love is especially important in surfacing nations, because love for the nation is out of hope and with nostalgia for how it could have been. So this gives a kind of like basic framework, and we however taking like guidance from these frameworks. Next slide, please. we formulate the kind of framework that's we have developed inductively called futurist nostalgia. Nostalgia in Indian authoritarian populism has some distinctive features, which requires the elaboration of an inductively developed new concept called futurist nostalgia, a framework for analysis that clarifies the relation between populist affect and mobilization in India. So first of all, it's overtly religious. We argue that Ram and Ram Rajya are not just symbols from a, in the case of India, how this is different is like, and we are focusing on Ram and Ram Rajya as, you know, how, as the vehicles of this futurist nostalgia. So Ram and Ram Rajya are not just symbols from a mythologized version of a historical past, but a mythology derived from ancient texts. So Ram is a ancient Hindu god who is mentioned in the epic Ramayana. He's not just mentioned, he's the hero of the epic Ramayana. So how it is used in these concepts, and Ram Rajya is the golden era of Ram's rule in the mythology. So how this is used in contemporary India is that the mythology derived from ancient texts, Hindu nationalist proponents have sought to construct it as an actually existing historical past, and which has been endorsed by scientific bodies and courts in India. And in the use of religious mythology, this is also connected to what Dr. Gudavarthy was talking about. It's kind of using it to overcome the diversity of population in India, which is segregated in so many different ways. And the prime purpose is to maintain and grow power by means of expanding appeal to different groups, and emphasize how diverse groups can be constructed into a unified people. And this goes beyond kind of a restorative nostalgia, which talks about, you know, restoring past glory to solve the present crisis. It actually talks about drawing inspiration from past glory for a future glory. So futurist nostalgia is fueled by an affective economy of optimism, confidence, duty, freedom from the mindset of slavery, pride, authenticity, all positive emotional valences, self-confidence that is derived from the glorious past, that's Ram Rajya, and also the, you know, everlasting faith of Hinduism, which was able to withstand multiple aggressions on it and multiple kind of oppressive colonial forces to aspire for a glorious future, to be a world leader in the like it was in the past. So Ram and Ram Rajya constitute a futurist nostalgia in which the past is used to mobilize in the present through unification and constructing of a people, and also to prefigure the future. So next slide, please. So we have briefly analyzed how this plays out. Like in the paper, we go into, you know, the historical development of this, because it has a very deep historical, the notion of futurist nostalgia it's not like relegated to the present. It has its underpinnings in history, how it has unfolded, and it takes on a lot of metaphors and everything from the evolution of Hindutva politics in India, and also like the role of secular governments like Congress and Congress leaders, etc. But for this presentation, we briefly touching upon, you know, like some of the empirical work that we have done in the present, analyzing the present. So Ram politics in the present. So these are some of the images here. Next slide, please. So we are analyzing the contemporary Ram politics by 4 major broad themes, but I'm not going to go into each one as such. So Ram, the figure, and Ram Rajya, how it features in contemporary populist mobilization, Ram temple, the cultural infrastructure of futurist nostalgia within which this Ram Rajya is embedded, and a global Ram Rajya. So next slide, please. I'll give you a few examples. I think I'm already over time, but few examples of how Ram is kind of used. So this is a quote from the Bhumi Pujan ceremony. That's a groundbreaking ceremony for the new Ram temple that is, going to be built in Ayodhya. So Ayodhya is the birthplace of the god Ram. It's a city in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and so after a huge, it has a whole lot of history behind it and a relevance in Indian politics. But the thing is that now the courts have granted a go ahead to construct a Ram temple. Is the time over? I think Priya dropped out. But it's okay. So I'll go ahead and talk about how Ram is used as a symbol for creating an equivalential chain. That is a symbol of unified people, which circulates through the emotions of love, duty, inspiration, and strength. And at the same time, also an antagonistic frontier. On the other hand, the sign of Ram denotes the immortal soul of India that withstood medieval invaders, which signals to erstwhile Muslim kings and also Muslims in general, which also signifies a unified and resilient people who withstood against these invaders. So Ram becomes the sign of both a unified people through positive emotions like love, duty, inspiration, strength, and at the same time, a kind of a tenacity against invaders. And at the same time, next, Priya, next. We can go forward, yeah, next. And at the same time, he also signifies kind of an antagonistic frontier in the erstwhile elites who neglected the name of Ram. So this ever-present symbol of Ram as a source of pride and identity and the very basis of cultural and territorial unity of India and the cradle for the love of the nation was sidelined by the elites who felt a sense of shame in even acknowledging the reality of Ram. So this is against again a quote from Modi's speech at the Deepotsav, like a festival for celebrating Ram. And this kind of neglect has led to a kind of infrastructural and developmental decay, like he talks about it. The morale for the country's development has weakened. Looking at the pathetic condition of our places considered as a symbol of our identity and existence. So by neglecting the existence of Ram, it has kind of caused infrastructural and developmental decay. And this is to be fixed by a Ram-infused politics. So if we go to the next slide, it talks about how the present government draws a straight line of inspiration from the golden era of Ram's rule in its current state programs and political slogans. But not just that, it also presents a future aspiration prefigured in the character and the lessons of Ram. So he said, so sabka saath, sabka vikas, sabka vishwas, sabka prayas. These are all political slogans of the BJP and Modi government, and very explicitly linked to the values of Ram. And it said that the inspiration was, Ram. And the Modi stresses that the lessons from the person of Ram are multi-pronged and circulates them through an affective economy of positive emotional valency, that is sense of freedom from slavery, self-belief fostered by a pride of the past glory, and a sense of duty, resolve, determination to craft the future in light of this glorious heritage. And this articulation is repetitive. It's reiterated at multiple forums and multiple contexts, and the messaging is also interlinked, especially to the government's present actions and future visions. So if we go to the next slide, a kind of another example of how Modi connects the current vision of the government, which is Panch Prans, which is basically translated into 5 pledges for India going forward for the next 25 years, which is the Amrit Kal. He connects those 5 pledges of, goal of developed India, removing any trace of colonial mindset, taking pride in our roots and heritage, fostering unity and a sense of duty. This is said to be embodied in Ram, who's not only the inspiration, but also the epitome of its realization. So it's connecting like his government's policy and vision to the character and lessons of Ram. Next slide, please. And the persona of Modi himself. It's interesting to note, moreover, that the articulator-in-chief, Prime Minister Modi, in many of these public appearances, takes on the form of a humble devotee, emphasizing pious darshan, which is a divine witness, doing devotional practices, sitting in meditation among chants, uttering Sanskrit verses, placing himself as a learned scholar of the civilizational nation, and at the same time an everyday believer, a humble devotee of not just Ram actually, but multiple sidelined and neglected heroes and gurus. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this kind of what Dr. Gudavarthy was talking about as well, that it is a simultaneous vision in which Ram Rajya, which is the golden rule of Ram, which is said to be the which inspiration for the vision of the future, futurist nostalgia, in other words, is at the same time like presented as the epitome of ethical governance, a realm of peace and impartial governance, which takes everybody together. But at the same time, this Ram Rajya is also denoting strength and a kind of Hindu pride. So in some articulations, Ram Rajya is associated with banning Urdu, which is kind of primarily spoken by Muslims and associated with Muslims, and it's said to be against religious. So in Ram Rajya, there will be policies against religious conversions and minority appeasement, and so there will be development of every section of the society, but at the same time, a national Hindu day and a kind of banning of madrasas, etc. So it coexists in this kind of formulation of Ram Rajya, the vision of Ram Rajya. And finally, like if we talk about it, next slide, please. This Ram and Ram Rajya is actually embedded in a larger project of building cultural infrastructures, which is increasingly stressed by Modi in several contexts. So Hindutva populists have caught on to and reinterpreted this concept of cultural infrastructure, which is used in many other contexts of the world, as a material means to circulate this affective economy of both resentment and aspiration that the futurist nostalgia of Ram Rajya too requires. So the shape that this cultural infrastructure takes in the context of Hindutva futurist nostalgia is monumental infrastructural projects that seek to represent and highlight the coexistence of both modern and ancient in contemporary India. So, but what is to be stressed is that by tradition and culture here, what is primarily meant is Hindu faith centers, pilgrimages, temples, and mythological roots. And it refers to like temple restorations, creations of big temple corridors, renovations of pilgrimage sites. And the intention is to circulate affect of pride in heritage and traditions and overcoming inferiority, along with promoting a modern market comfort and notions of progress. So if, for example, he talks about the Ramayana circuit, which is like a rail project it's an elaborate rail project that kind of centers Ramayana and its story and major places mentioned in Ramayana. Bharat Gaurav Rail, meaning Bharat pride, India's pride rail. Swadesh Darshan, like, kind of witnessing, like these are all rail projects and they are named like in a way so as to instill pride, like, in ancient cities that have been neglected, but which are now going to be developed under schemes such as pilgrimage, rejuvenation, and spiritual augmentation drive, which kind of acronym is the acronym is Prasad, which also like translate to religious offerings. So there are multiple such infrastructural projects which connect to each other and refer to each other. And mostly they are tied to positive affective states through, like in this quote itself, it talks about reawakening cultural splendor and revival of dharmic heritage, that is religious heritage. And in contrast to cultural infrastructure projects in other contexts of the world, which aim to promote free-flowing thoughts and interactions and promoting creativity and engagement that could then produce other effects such as economic growth. The Hindutva cultural infrastructure is a regimented developmental project that promotes fixed, past-based religious tourism as cultural renaissance, creating virtuous citizens in the process. It is another vehicle, we feel that it's another vehicle for the Hindutva for futurist nostalgia that circulates resentment, that is of past destructions of these heritage and also neglect by past destruction of this heritage by invaders, Muslim invaders, and also neglect by elites. And at the same time instills confidence of owning up to these heritage and the identity, with the aim of building an amorphous Hindu identity, dismissing the diversity and pluralistic heritage within Hinduism into the service of a unified cultural infrastructure that restores Hindu temples into mega corridors with modern amenities on the one hand, and absorbs local deities, gurus, and indigenous warriors on the other, in the service of a unified cultural resurgence. So I think I'll stop at that. I hope I've not exceeded the time, and it's still work in progress, and looking forward to suggestions and feedbacks. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Let's move now to Anuj Bhuwania. I can't see. There he is. Okay, now Anuj's very interesting book sort of challenges one of the assumptions in a lot of the populist literature, which is that populism erodes institutions, that populism is the enemy of the courts. Anuj's book actually makes it a more complicated argument, which is that the courts in India act as populist actors, which I found really interesting. So thank you, Anuj, for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Priya. Am I audible? I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'll make a slight change to what I thought I would speak about, which is about the judiciary. I was actually speaking more about the question of constitutions itself. Now, what I will be speaking about is the fact that constitutionalism has actually been less of a stumbling block to the path of Hindutva in the last 10 years than was otherwise thought. So in the global discourse on democratic backsliding, where the archetypes are Hungary, Poland, Turkey, etc., what's foregrounded, what's pretty obvious when you study them is that all of these regimes saw thoroughgoing changes in the constitutional framework itself, which enabled the popularly elected leaders to undo much of the liberal edifices of those countries. In India, however, what is interesting about India, though it's often equated with these countries now, and it's seen as a kind of one of the more egregious instances of democratic backsliding globally. What is interesting about India is that we've seen hardly any changes in the constitution in the last 10 years. That Modi has been able to further his political agenda without changing much of the Indian constitutional framework, really. There have been a couple of changes, but not I would say, arguably, nothing central to the constitutional framework itself. So what's striking is, to me, that the agenda of Hindutva majoritarianism is actually quite compatible. What I'm arguing is that it is quite compatible with the Indian constitutional project. That the malleability of the Indian constitution is actually what enables much of this kind of populism to be able to do as it deems without making any changes to the constitution itself. Interestingly, there have been people already who have been talking about how India is already a Hindu Rashtra, electorally so, without having the need to change the constitution. What I would take as a kind of example to further illustrate this is something that's going on as we speak. The hearing in the Supreme Court right now on the status of Kashmir, the changes that brought about in August 2019. There were two major changes. One was on the special status of Kashmir, Article 370. The other is what I'm going to focus on, which is that the state of Jammu and Kashmir, the erstwhile Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, was converted to what's called a union territory. Now, this is of course sub judice and it's being argued, like I said, right now, you can see on YouTube this case being argued. But what is remarkable is that on the face of it, Articles 3 and 4 of the Indian Constitution actually allow the center, the union to unilaterally make changes to the very structure of the states, to convert, to dissolve one state, and to merge two states. For instance, the erstwhile state of Hyderabad was dissolved in 1956 and merged with another state called Andhra Pradesh. So what is remarkable is the very identity of the states can be changed, and that through a simple majority. This is remarkable in many ways, and I'm talking under the aegis of an Australian institution right now, and that this should be quite anomalous by any any understanding of federalism. And it was indeed noted to be so by an Australian federalism scholar almost 2 weeks after the Constitution came into force. A comparative federalism scholar called K.C. Weir wrote an article in February 2009, in February 1950, in the Venerable Allahabad Law Journal, where he was struck by how the 1915 Indian Constitution is actually more centralizing than the 1935 Act, the late colonial act which governed the British India till then. And also he said that it's precisely because of these provisions, Articles 3 and 4, India can actually not be considered a federal constitution, but a quasi-federal one. This term has since haunted Indian federalism studies, and but it's important to note that this has been picked up by all manner of people, including in 1987, the then BJP president L.K. Advani gave a presidential address in Vijayawada, where he noted that India is not a federal country, because you can't have provisions like that and be called a federal country. And he noted that India should maybe move from having 20 odd states as it then had to 60 odd states, because this provision is there, and this in a sense enabled such thoroughgoing changes. Now, what is interesting to note is that since 1950, the status of Indian Constitution, which is seen as a kind of like an anomalous entity, by the 90s, Indian Constitution had almost become a kind of a model constitution for the global South. And the fate of federalism is quite interesting. From being seen as not federal enough, by the 90s, Indian federalism had almost become a model, and explicitly argued to be so by no less a figure than well-known political scientist Alfred Stepan, where he in a couple of very important, very influential pieces, he's actually argued that the US has stopped being a model for federalism for most multi-ethnic, multicultural countries, and it's India which has become the model. But it's interesting to read about. The last iteration of that argument was in 2012 with this formulation of something called state nation, which has become quite influential since then. Now, what's interesting is that in this formulation is precisely the flexibility of Articles 3 and 4, that the provision which enables the Union to unilaterally change the constitution, the very identity of a state. Those provisions were precisely the condition of possibility for Stepan for having this something called state nation. That is, that precisely the fact that India could accommodate the Indian Union could accommodate the demands of various ethnic communities, forging new states for instance, in the Northeast. That's the example Northeast of India. Enabled this flexibility is precisely the strength of the Indian federalism was what was argued. Now, what is interesting is that in hindsight, obviously, this provision, what happened in August 2019 has led to a kind of a sobering realization that there may have been a problem with these provisions. And in recent comparative work on federalism, it's argued that perhaps India offers a sobering lesson for federalism scholars on the importance of formal rules regarding federalism and the continuing effect of design choice. Right? That in other words, surprise, surprise, constitution matters. And it's interesting because so much of federalism studies in India have been dominated by particularly the experience of 1989 to 2014, when there was a coalition government, a kind of a coalition government of representing various parties from all over the country. That somehow the very structure of the kind of the centralizing structure of the constitution itself was forgotten. So that is one lesson. The second lesson is that Indian Constitution, I would argue, is explicitly designed for what particularly in Indian legal discourse is called misuse, right? And there are multiple instances of this, that Indian Constitution was drafted in a kind of disregard of the problem of entrenchment. Now, entrenchment is very heart of what Constitution is supposed to do. It's in the kind of a balance between politics and constitution and constitutionalism. What a constitution does is entrenches certain things that cannot be changed by an elected majority with any ease, right? And in India, that was conspicuous by its absence in very key areas. Most famously, of course, in the amendment provision itself, where the process of amendment was made remarkably easy. But also important provisions like Article 356, which enabled elected central governments to dismiss elected state governments, and that was the bane of Indian federalism for the first 50 years of its existence. And there are other examples like ordinances, for instance. And another very important example, all of which are being weaponized right now by the current government, of course, is the refusal to constitutionalize criminal procedure. That India is one of the few countries with much feted bills of rights, which actually refuse to minimize criminal procedure except in a very minimal manner. Recently, Ambedkar's granddaughter's husband Mr. Anand Tiltumbe was released, and there was an interview, a very interesting interview published with him and his wife, that is Ambedkar's granddaughter. When Ambedkar's granddaughter was wondering if the constitution that her grandfather was instrumental in drafting could coexist with provisions like Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which has been weaponized so effectively by the current government. Now, sadly, my answer would be yes, they are actually, because the Indian Constitution actually refused to constitute, and this is an acrimonious exchange of the Constitutional Assembly debates, where one leader in the Assembly debate actually explicitly told Ambedkar that you are a lawyer, you know what's going to happen if you don't constitutionalize certain principles of the criminal procedure. And if you're under pressure to do this, you better resign than defend a provision like this. But of course, that did not happen, and India has a rather minimalist, regimen of criminal procedure, which has been constitutionalized. Anyway, so there's a problem of under-entrenchment, and there's a problem of centralization, which has been quite central to Indian constitutional design itself. I mean, in this, what I'm trying to do is that in much of the study on Indian populism, Indian contemporary politics, crisis of Indian politics now, it's the Constitution itself is given a free ride. It's not the Constitution itself is seen as a problem. It's precisely what I'm trying to question now. That actually there is a kind of that in the process of drafting of the Constitution, there were certain departures made from standard constitutional making, which have enabled a leader like Modi to do as he pretty much deems fit. What I'm trying to argue then is that if we are trying to understand the nature of why is it that this kind of touching faith in the elected government, in the kind of refusal to entrench key provisions of the Constitution, why is it that was done? There could be two explanations. One was that, of course, it was a wartime constitution. Increasingly, partisan violence of that era, when the Constitution was drafted, is actually designated as a civil war. And recently, Shruti Kapila has argued that the correct term for what was going on at the time was civil war. It's a wartime constitution. And secondly, it was a completely single party dominated constitution. By the time that Pakistan was partition was declared on 3rd June 1947, 93% of the members of the Constitution Assembly were Congress members, and after 25 Muslim League members rejoined the Assembly, it became 85%. And the other leaders, non-Congress, non-League leaders, are really literally co-opted into the Assembly, right? Secondly, what I'm trying to argue then is that it's a one-party dominant constitution which can think of no possibility in the near future of any other party dominating the center in the manner it did. So when you have a provision like 356, which in a sense constitutionalizes something like a militant democracy kind of form, the worry that a far left or far right would come to power at the state level was there. Therefore, a provision like 356 was incorporated, but not the central level. So there was no worry. So there was no need to worry about the abuse of provisions like 356. In fact, Ambedkar specifically talks about the idea of the problem of misuse or abuse in the context of debate of 356 or ordinances, but says that, well, he does not see that that's happening. So what I'm arguing then is that these instances, these examples of single party domination and civil war are really not, they're not, in the Americanism, it's not it's a feature, not a bug of the Constitution. Why is it that there's a single party domination? Why is there civil war? And here I'm going to quote no less than Ambedkar himself. So this is Ambedkar writing in 1945 in this text, which is much ignored, called Communal Deadlock and the Way to Solve It. He says, I must say that I'm wholly opposed to the proposals of a constitutional assembly. It is absolutely superfluous. I regard it as a most dangerous project, which may involve this country in a civil war. So this warning of his that the assembly, the way it was proposed, and remember, if you read Ambedkar's writings before 1946, he's implacably opposed until December 1946, when there's a kind of a volte-face. He's implacably opposed to the idea of constitutional assembly. He repeatedly and most stringently in this other well-known book called What Gandhi and Congress Have Done to the Untouchables, he's repeatedly talking about what constitutional assembly would mean. In fact, he actually argues about the Cripps Mission of 1942, that that the Cripps's concession of Pakistan as well as concession of Constitutional Assembly were meant to appease both Congress and the Assembly and the Muslim League. So while Pakistan was meant to appease the League, the concession of the Constitutional Assembly being formed was meant to appease the Congress. So Congress in 1934 had made it central to its political agenda, absolutely central. This is specifically argued to be so by Nehru in his presidential address in 1936, when he became president of the International Congress. That absolutely central to the Congress project of 1936 is to have a constitutional assembly, which should be popularly elected, right? Now, Ambedkar was repeatedly writing against this. Why was he writing against this? Interestingly, in all his arguments against the idea of the Constitutional Assembly, he's echoing actually the other well-known opponent of the assembly, which is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who also was using similar terms to think about the assembly. Now, what I'm trying to do in this project is really move the focus of understanding the nature of the Indian Constitution and its drafting and its design away from the assembly debates of 46 to 49. I believe that Indian Constitution scholars have a kind of a fetish of the Indian Constitutional Assembly debates, where they've kind of forgotten the process. They kind of a deliberate eliding of how the assembly itself was elected and how it was constituted. And in a sense, a deliberate avoidance of the 30-year process of negotiation, constitutional negotiations, which was initiated in 1946 by the Lucknow Pact, culminating in the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. The 30-year prehistory of constitutional drafting, where the central question really, and anybody who studies this history knows it very well, the central question is obviously the Muslim question, and to a lesser extent the Dalit question, right? So the minority question is absolutely central to this. And throughout this period, there are various forms of entrenching consociationalism, which is attempted, right? Catherine Adenauer, a political scientist, has actually plotted these various experiments in kind of in consociationalism, drafting consociationalism between 1916 and 1946, from Lucknow Pact to the 1919 Act, to the Simon Commission, to the Nehru Report, to the 35 Act, etc., and a couple of others. And she's actually plotted them along kind of the axis made famous by Lippard. And what is remarkable is that the high point of this consociational question, of this consociational attempt, is actually the Cabinet Mission Plan, which is almost completely consociational. And the lowest point is tellingly enough, the 1950 Constitution of India. So where she rates it as absolutely zero in terms of consociationalism. So what I'm trying to argue is, based on Kim Chapelet's influential formulation of aversive constitutionalism, where she argues that the nature of constitution should be understood through its aversive alternatives, the one that are so forcefully rejected that they cast their influence over the whole constitution building effort and incorporates a nation-making sense of rejection of a whole constitutional possibility. And I think that's a very important formulation for Indian scholars to reflect on, for scholars working on India to reflect on. And the obvious model that the Indian Constitution 1950 is aversive to is the Cabinet Mission Plan. And I think it's time that we rescue the 46 Commission plan from the kind of what he often calls the enormous conditions of austerity, with which much Indian scholarship treats it as a kind of impractical, almost absurdly impossible plan that is thought about. So I would say that it's if you reflect on what it was responding to, and of course the most famous example of this aversion to the 46 plan is by K.M. Munshi, one of the ideological forefathers of the party in power currently, where he argued. I mean, of course, Munshi had a very important role in the Constitutional Assembly. Where he was positively gleeful at the failure of the mission plan. Remember, the implication of the mission plan is, of course, immediately that it was either the plan or the mission plan or partition. And partition was obviously inevitability after the failure of the plan. The Congress is actually quite willing to go down that route. Of course, this is what is interesting is that this is, of course, a very murky and complicated area of political history, much written about and completely revisited after the publication of Transfer of Power papers in the 80s, and Ajay's famous revisionist history based on that. But what is interesting is that while Transfer of Power papers has completely reshaped the history of the 1940s and this kind of political history, it has completely been ignored by constitutional history. Constitutional history, for much of the scholars of scholarship of Indian, people writing on the Constitution, especially, begins in December 1946 with some little bit of prehistory prior to that. But what's interesting is, so what's interesting is that this history is ignored. But Munshi, when we read somebody like Munshi, he actually said that whatever other members may feel, this is other Constitutional Assembly members, I feel, thank God, that we have got out of this picture bag at last. We have no sections and groups to go into, no elaborate procedure as was envisaged by it, no double majority clauses. All these are examples of the complicated version of the Commission plan. We therefore feel free to form a federation of our choice, a federation with a center as strong as we can make it. Therefore, sir, I personally am not at all sorry that this change has taken place. We have now a homogeneous country, though our frontiers have shrunk. Now, this is the sentiment which is actually much more widely shared than one thinks. In fact, Ambedkar himself uses this term, homogeneous country, in positive terms repeatedly in his writings during this period. As late as his thoughts on linguistic states in 1955, he's talking about himself as the theorist of Pakistan and as making possible this new homogeneity. Of course, in this idea of homogeneity that they're talking about, they are very much, because they are very much thinking in terms of the idea of the European idea of the nation state, which is, as we know, at the time, pretty much one of the only ideas of a nation state that could have. And this Commission plan obviously militated against it fundamentally. Anyway, so what I'm trying to argue then is that any kind of robust confederal or federal consortialism was precisely what the Constitutional Assembly was averse to and explicitly averse to. And what they were trying to make sure was a kind of a constitution which could enable the example of majoritarianism that Ambedkar had warned about in his 1946 writings. And if you want to understand the volte-face of Ambedkar, it's interesting to revisit Ambedkar's own approach to partition, which has now been written about extensively and has been revisited now, about how he himself, in his desperate attempts to avoid the Cabinet Mission plan itself, he goes as much as to go to Churchill and try to persuade Churchill to stop from any transfer of power in terms of the plan, or even he goes to the UN trying to oppose the Indian government. And in fact, Jan Smuts, the South African leader, picks up on Ambedkar to argue that, well, actually, in many ways, India practices a worse form of apartheid than South Africa. Anyway, so this is an interesting history to revisit, which Indian constitutional scholars could do well to revisit. But anyway, so all I'm trying to argue then is that in many ways, it's important to revisit the original sense of Indian constitutional design, to understand how a model that how a certain form of majoritarianism was inscribed in the Constitution itself, precisely because the Constitutional Assembly itself was deeply majoritarian in its very nature, as Ambedkar had repeatedly warned. How am I doing for time?
I think you're out of time, unfortunately. So we probably have to move on to Shweta and Monica.
Yeah.
But I think the gist of your very interesting argument. Thank you, Anuj.
Thank you.
Okay, Shweta and Monica, are you there? Yeah, and you don't have a PowerPoint, right? No.
No, we don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay, so who's going? Are you both presenting, or are you is one speaking and then the other? Or?
No, both of us are presenting, so I'll go in first, and then Monica will be joining in.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Priya, and thank you, ECPS, for inviting us. It's very interesting to be on this panel, and it's been very interesting to listen to the conversations that have been happening, especially starting off with Ajay in terms of ideas on Leklau, and then moving on to Maggie and then Anuj. Now, it's the, I think, where do we start our story? And if we are looking at starting our story, we need to look at how populism research has really spanned in the last few decades. Now, there are different entry points to research on populism, and its meaning and conceptualization continues to be greatly debated, ranging from what we heard in the morning, from populism being a thin-centered ideology as articulated by Mudd and Kaltwasser, to it being a political logic, rather the logic of the people as articulated by Leklau. But it's important to emphasize that if we look at the preceding three presentations also, most studies on populism have been focused on the domestic ramifications of populism, which is very interesting and which is very pertinent. But where do we make our entry point? Monica and I have been interested in the international ramifications of populism. How do we conceptualize populism? And how do we, for instance, look at the interconnections or the interlinkages between populism and foreign policy? So that's where we are really coming in from. Now, this is not to say that there's not been research. There is still research that is happening on populism and the international dimensions of populism. So for instance, there's been very interesting research which is happening on how populism challenges the structure of liberal international order, or how various versions of populism or how various variants of populism interact with globalization. There's been some bit of research on populism and foreign policy decision making. There are a few others which look at trade and immigration. So I think what is still marginalized in terms of this interlinkage between populism and the international aspects of populism or its international ramification is this issue of refugee policy. So, how do we actually look at refugee policy as foreign policy? And how do we then explore the interconnections between populism and foreign policy? Are there any interconnections that we can actually interrogate? For instance, in the case of India. We have to admit this paper is really work in progress. Both Monica and I actually look forward to any critical feedbacks, your thoughts on this paper. This is still developing in terms of ideas. But in terms of the central puzzle, we are interested in understanding how does populism affect the foreign policy preferences and outcomes of populist governments in power. And I want to stress on both the words preferences and outcomes. Now, while India is one of the few non-Western Asian contexts that has been the focus of investigation in terms of conceptualization of populist radical right politics, there are very few studies that engage with the Indian case to interrogate the link between populism on one hand and foreign policy on the other. Now, there are two specific studies that look at it. There is Plageman and Destrandi, and there is Wodzwicki. Now, if you look at Plageman and Destrandi's study, the overall argument that Plageman and Destrandi make is they're focused on bilateral diplomacy, they're focused on multilateral diplomacy, they're looking at the whole idea of global governance, but they do not discern any substantive shift in Modi's foreign policy, in the Modi government's populist foreign policy as it's been classified. On the other hand, if we look at Bodzwicki's argument, he's looking at international populism and its impact in terms of electoral coalitions. So that there are these two broad studies in the context of exploring the link between populism and foreign policy in India. Now, when we started to work on this area, and we've been interested in this area, we started off by doing a very extensive review of the literature. And as an outcome of that review of the literature, we could identify three key gaps, and that's where we make our entry point. One was, how do we actually conceptualize populism? If you look at the existing studies on populism and foreign policy, most studies actually look at populism and foreign policy as a thin-centered ideology. And as Ajay very rightly talked about, there are limitations to engaging with this idea of populism as a thin-centered ideology in a non-Western context like India. There are few studies that look at Leclau, and they look at populism as a political logic. But I think they stop there. They look at populism as a political logic, a logic which is obviously used to exemplify or signify the idea of people as empty signifiers. But there is a gap there. How do you actually then look at this idea of people in terms of the process of signification? So I think that's one of the key gaps that we were able to identify. The second is in terms of how do we actually conceptualize foreign policy? And I think that's also very interesting, because most research on populism and foreign policy has been focused on a very narrow conceptualization of foreign policy. So there's been a lot of focus, for instance, on global governance. There's a lot of focus in terms of multilateral and bilateral diplomacy. But the issue of migration and refugee tends to be marginalized. And that is because there is a tendency in the literature not to recognize refugee policy as foreign policy, something that we actually question and interrogate. The third is, when we are looking at this idea or this conceptualization of populism, the conceptualization of foreign policy, how do we then account for contextual specificities in terms of the different variants of populism across the globe? So, what is the potential in terms of the template that we are offering in terms of an intersectional approach? Now, I want to go back to the first 2 points that I was making in terms of the conceptualization of populism. How do we conceptualize populism? And how do we then move on to conceptualize foreign policy? And why there was value in looking at an intersectional approach to populism, especially, and so in terms of going back to the first point, I think there is a need to understand, and I think this is something that I've already said, that there are limitations in terms of looking at populism as a thin-centered ideology. And most research on populism and foreign policy tend to look at these antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite. But what they fall short of doing is that how do you actually conceptualize this idea of people? Because this category of people tend to be very monolithic in its conceptualization. Now, Mudd and Kaltwasser would respond to this and say that no, in this template, there is scope in terms of, there is scope because you can look at ideas of distinguishability, categorizability, travelability, et al. And they would say that, they would pay attention to the idea of host ideology. So that host ideology, for instance, can be the idea of social populism, that host ideology can be the idea of national populism. But still, if we probe this further, it still falls short in terms of looking at what constitutes this idea of people. And I think we are very interested in this idea of people, both in terms of its domestic ramification and in terms of its international ramifications. We are not focusing in terms of the domestic ramification, but we are focusing on the international ramification. But the domestic framing of this idea of populism is extremely important when we are trying to test the international ramification. So where do we begin? For us, we agree with Leclau that populism is not a thin-centered ideology, but it is a political logic. But where we take Leclau forward is, we say that this political logic hinges on discursive identity assemblages. And I think this is extremely important for us. So when we say this discursive logic hinges on discursive identity assemblages, we look at various constellations. And it was very interesting to hear Ajay in the morning because he was talking about caste and class, something that has been marginalized when we are trying to look at the framing of populist radical right in India. So what we really see is, and this goes back to my previous work with Elise Ferron, when I was looking at this in the context of Modi's India, is that we see an overlap in terms of these discursive intersectional constellations. This overlap is that race, ethnicity, and religion is central to this idea of populism, but there is also overlapping constellations of class and caste. Interestingly, when we did a mapping of the populist radical right sources, like 4 different kinds of sources, we looked at electoral speeches, pamphlets, radio programs like Man Ki Baat, and when we did an extensive mapping, there was a similarity in terms of index. Nearly 51% in the context of the focus in terms of race, ethnicity, and religion, and close overlapping percentage in terms of the class caste idea. So it's very interesting in terms of this complex intersectional constellations that go on to signify this idea of people. So people definitely is not a monolithic category that we are looking at. So in that context, I think where we are really coming in is we are pushing to transcend this right-left axis when we are trying to look at this idea of populist radical right politics. And we are pushing to look at, or we propose to classify populist radical right movements depending on whether they include or exclude individuals on the basis of religion, ethnicity, class, caste, age, and gender identity. And this is where the intersectional lens becomes extremely important for us in terms of having that conversation with Leclau. The second point that I wanted to put forth was, how do we actually conceptualize foreign policy? In this paper, we underline that we need to pay attention to refugee policy as foreign policy, something that has been marginalized in the existing literature. Scholars have argued, and there is an extensive body of literature on migration studies, and there's an extensive body of literature on populism. But what are the kind of intersections that we are looking at? So scholars have argued that migration policies belong to the core business of a state's foreign policy. States are implicated in international agreements, acknowledging the rights of refugees via international treaties, and are bound by them in terms of economic integration schemes. States regulate foreigners, access to labor market. Furthermore, nationality remains at the core of visa regimes. And if you look at South Asia, very interestingly, refugee movements have led to both conflict and cooperation in bilateral relations. So for instance, you can look at the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan, India and Sri Lanka, India and Bangladesh, India and Afghanistan. And they have also led South Asian states to adopt differing positions on UN-led global instruments for refugee protection and engagement with international or regional organizations. In this context, and I underline this, in this context, we argue refugee policy is foreign policy. And it's important because, this conceptualization of populism using the template of using the intersectional template, and this conceptualization of foreign policy as refugee policy allows us to make 3 important theoretical conceptual moves. Monica will come into in terms of the empirical part of this, but I think these are important contributions in terms of where we are taking this conversation forward. First, as I said, when you look at or when you consider refugee policy as foreign policy, then it becomes a site for signification and reproduction of difference between the people and the dangerous foreign other. Second, it enables the interrogation of these categories of difference, the people and the dangerous foreign others, not as monolithic, but as intersectionally constructed along varying discursive identity constellations. And as I said, on a spectrum of race, gender, religion, nationality, ethnicity, and so on. And this is very critical when we are looking at a nuanced understanding of how domestic populist politics, relying on such discursive identity assemblages, are connected to particular shifts in policy preferences and outcomes in the names of foreign policy. Third, such an approach also helps us for developing empirically grounded insights to look at the structural and systematic relations of power. In this presentation, we are not really talking about the politics of neighbors in the context of Myanmar and Bangladesh, but that's something that we are developing in the paper. So we just did not want to bring it here right now. But against this theoretical conceptual backdrop, we deploy an original and innovative intersectional analytical approach to investigate the links between populism and foreign policy through a case study of India's refugee policy under the BJP-led Modi government. I'll now invite Monica to come in terms of how we investigate this in the context of the Rohingya refugees. Monica.
Thanks, Shweta, and excuse me, thank you, Priya, and everyone else involved in convening this panel. I'm acutely aware of the time, and I will try and just perhaps give you a little flavor of the empirical analysis rather than really kind of opening it up for any kind of scrutiny, at least not in my delivery. So in our analysis, we examine three shifts that we that appear to have taken place under the BJP-led Modi government since 2014 with respect to its refugee policy, particularly in relation to the Rohingyas. The first one is a sort of institutional legislative shift where we've seen amendments made to domestic legislation that is used to govern refugees and foreigners in India. There's no actual legal framework specifically for refugees in India. The state uses these three different acts to sort of monitor, control the movement of refugees, including sort of housing them, jailing them, and deporting them. But traditionally, and even though India is not a signatory of the Refugee Convention and its additional protocol, it's traditionally maintained and adhered to the principle of non-deportation or refoulement. And what we have seen is through these legislative changes, and these legislative changes have been broadly accompanied by a discursive shift, BJP leaders and other senior government officials using representations of refugees, particularly Rohingya refugees, as threatening, dangerous foreign others. Together with this discursive and institutional shift, we argue that there's been a normative shift then, that it's translated into a normative shift where we've now seen the deportation of Rohingyas. And India in the past has, not to our knowledge, certainly in our analysis, deported refugees who have been recognized, as refugees. And so what we have discerned is the different identity constellations that have been at play in these representations hinge on, these assemblages of race, ethnicity, and religion. And this is where we are kind of, trying to unpack and apply our intersectional approach to populism. There's only 10 minutes to the hour left, so I'll leave it. And yeah, over to Priya.
Okay, thank you, Monica. All right, now we have 10 minutes for, well, maybe 5 minutes for questions. Are there any questions from any of the audience members? I can't see anything in the chat. Just raise your hands if you have a question. Yes, Buland. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much for these inspiring and insightful presentations. I am very grateful to hear and listen to these great presenters. My question is that we experience in the Western world, especially in Europe, that these populist leaders and populist actors interact very efficiently and they collaborate very, very efficiently. They inspire from each other, and they repeat a kind of manual, and they follow the same process to establish a kind of populist authoritarian regime, like Erdogan imitating Putin, Viktor Orban is imitating Erdogan, Netanyahu is imitating Erdogan again. Do you think there's a kind of interaction between Indian populist actors and the other actors around the world, especially from China or Pakistan or Russia? How this mechanism operates in Indian case? My question is open to any panelists' contribution.
We'll end. We might take another question and then we'll answer them. So Proma, do you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Priya. Hi, everyone in the panel. It was fantastic listening to you all. So I have two questions and I'll be brief with them as much as.
Can we hear Proma? I can't. Ah, there you are. I think Proma, can you? No, you dropped out. Do you want to type the question? Okay, and in the meantime, we've got. Ah, yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll just start again. Fantastic presentations to, all the presenters were really insightful with their own, presenting their own understandings of Hindutva and populism at large. So my question is directed at the experts on the Hindutva discourse, and it is concerned with the dynamic gender discourse of Hindutva, particularly its interesting positioning on the issue of queer identities. So in the recent years, we have seen that some perspectives from the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, increasingly favorable towards same-sex marriage or living, right? So this is in contrast to how PRR parties, populist radical right parties in Europe, rampantly displaying queerphobia. And also in Latin America, we have seen how Bolsonaro, for example, is infamously homophobic. So my question is, with regard to Hindutva, every hegemonic populist discursive formation has its own strong boundaries, right? We may call them equivalential logics as per Laclau. So by becoming so accommodationist, is Hindutva at the risk of diluting its boundaries? So that is one question. And the other very brief comment, rather reflective comment, is it deals with Maggie and your paper, Priya. So we know that nostalgia, as per your paper, it can be a pretty important tool for PRR parties like the BJP. So I was wondering if nostalgia can be of use to the mobilizational strategies of left-wing populists. And this may be beyond the scope of your paper, so please feel free to ignore this question if it is beyond the scope of your paper. We know that memories of militant trade union movements and peasant movements of yesteryears can also probably serve as reflective nostalgia, if not restorative nostalgia, for left-wing populist parties. So how far can they be effective? So these are the two questions I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we've got one more question from Ibrahim. Muted. You're muted.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm an economist, so quite naturally, I would like to hear some aspect of economics in the rise and progress of populism in India. So, because as you know, the role of economics in the progress of populism is also quite significant parameter. So just I am looking at the situation of India in terms of, let's say, the change of per capita GDP in India. By the way, my question is open to the floor. Anybody would kindly contribute to my question. So the per capita GDP, for instance, in India started to rise from around $250 at the beginning of 1980s. As of today, it is around $1,500 as compared to $13,000 in China, starting almost from the same level of change at the beginning of 1980s. So India is, as of today, is lost in terms of per capita GDP as compared to world average, as compared to middle income countries, as compared to upper middle income countries, as compared to BRICS average. So whatever category you take, it seems that India is lost. So I would like to ask if there is no role of economics in the progress of populism in India. Isn't there any relationship between, let's say, culture, religion, and economics there? When I read the literature, I don't see so much uprisals, demonstrations in terms of poverty, income disequilibrium, etc. in India. The second and final aspect of my question is that it seems that a new era has already started from the viewpoint of India, because the major industrialized countries are now shifting from China into India. So it seems that despite authoritarian tendencies in India, global capitalism is gradually shifting into India, making it the locus of production and supply chains in the world. It seems that India is going to take a shift, take a new start from now on. How such an economic progress would impact current state of populism in India? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now, I might have Shweta, could you answer the question about populist actors learning from each other, since that's sort of a foreign policy question? And then I'll have Ajay, could you talk about the queer identities and whether the RSS accommodating queer identities is diluting the equivalential chains? And if we have time, we'll get to the two last questions on nostalgia and economics.
I'm not sure if I got the question right, Priya, but just responding to what Ibrahim was talking about, and I'll just take 30 seconds. I think when we are looking at this idea, I mean, if you're looking at the populist narrative, it's sabka saath, sabka vikas. And vikas to translate would mean in terms of development politics. So when we're talking about but there is a distinction here, Ibrahim. I mean, if you're looking at the rise of populists in let's say in Eastern Europe, or if you're looking at it in the context of Europe itself, it's very different from the Indian context. And I think that's the departure point in terms of our analysis. Here, religion, ethnicity, race, if I can use that as an intersectional constellation, is overlapping with the class dimension of it. So I think I would agree with what Ajay was talking about, that how there is this whole politics of culturalization in terms of be it the politics of religion or be it in the politics of caste. But to say that economics is not part of this discourse would be problematic. But I'm not sure if I actually understood your question right. But I would not classify this as a crisis of the neoliberal order, which is what some of the, many of the writings, for instance, on populism in the context of Europe have been talking about in terms of the politics of mobilization. So I would not definitely classify it as a crisis of the neoliberal order. I don't know if I answer this and I got your question right, but I'll stop here. Over to you, Ajay.
Yeah, to that specific question, Pruma, if you have seen, what RSS, recent promulgation, they said that they accept queer homosexual relations living together, but they do not accept marriage. So obviously they are making those boundary lines, that what is acceptable and not acceptable. So the question that whether this is leading to a kind of a dilution, I wouldn't say it's a dilution of an ideology, but I think they have changed, there's a shift in the strategy where they do recognize modern democratic principles. And that the entire project today is in terms of a certain process of appropriation of modern democratic principles, and they don't see a necessary conflict between the two. I think that partly came through in Anuj's presentation in terms of constitutionalism. So I think all modern democratic principles can be internally subverted. and that's how they're doing a bottom-up reading of these democratic principles. So if you take caste, they can do in terms of graded inequalities. There are internal hierarchies within OBCs and within, So what we talk in terms of intersectionality is that's where they see social fragmentation. So what is the conceptual distinction we make between intersectionality and what we talk in terms of equivalence? They can see in terms of social fragmentation, in turn itself consolidating a unified monolithic order. So they're actually sensing a different set of possibilities from our sense of articulation. So that needs a longer deliberation of how they go about doing that.
All right, now I think we have well and truly run out of time. Fiza, did you want to say some closing remarks?
So, Priya, do you want to have a concluding speech, or I should?
Oh, look, I think we're going over time, so I think but look, I want to thank everyone for participating. I think from Ajay, what I got out of your presentation was cultural pride. That's a key aspect of the authoritarian populist project in India, and cultural pride worked through different ways, through different groups, is what's being articulated here. Anuj, I think your point about the constitution being inherently compatible with authoritarianism because of its centralizing qualities is something that we need to pay more attention to. I think you're right. Shweta and Monica, I think there's a lot of work to be done on foreign policy and populism, so I'm really glad that we're doing it. And Maggie, we have some work to do with our paper as well, but thank you so much for presenting it in a half-written form. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And Fiza, and go ahead and...
So thank you, everyone, especially the presenters, the panelists. You enriched the panel. And thank you, Priya, for your moderation. With this, we end the session, but please mark your calendars for the next session, which will take place on the 20th of September at around 10 a.m. CET, which will be 1 p.m. in Pakistan, and I think 1:30 or 2 India. It will be on different aspects of religion, radicalism and populism in digital era in Pakistan. So please remember to register. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.